So I'd like to introduce Ferrel Guillory. He's a professor in the UNC School of Journalism and Mass Communication. He's the founder of the program on public life, which is the intersection of scholarship and the public agenda in the state and in the South. He was a newspaper journalist for 25 years and recently founded a new nonprofit devoted to covering education in North Carolina. You heard about that earlier, and it launches today. So
that's right. I'm going to put it up on the screen.
It couldn't be better timing. So thank you for being here, Ferrel. So I wanted to start by asking you if you could help us understand why the Common Core has generated so much political heat in the South, particularly, and where do you see that movement going as some states are reviewing or dumping these things?
Well, the short-term view, of course, is that the elections of 2010 and 2012 brought to power in most of our southern states both a substantial majority of Republican legislators and pretty sweeping array of Republican governors. But I tell my students to back up a little bit and to put it in broader context. You know, that they need to look at the current details, but also look at the broader view. And when the folks at EWA asked me to think about the politics of the South in this context, I tried to figure out where to begin. And I think I would begin with A Nation at Risk. Susan King mentioned it this morning. So I did a little reading back on the A Nation at Risk report. It came out, as you know, in the middle of President Reagan's first term. And President Reagan did an important thing in terms of the politics of the South. Richard Nixon, after his 1968 campaign, between 68 and 72, developed what came to be called the Southern Strategy, winning over conservative white Democrats to the Republican Party, people who had voted for George Wallace in 1968 and had concerns about federal court rulings on desegregation and other civil rights things. President Reagan's education agenda will sound familiar to you. Prayer in the schools, vouchers, tuition tax credits, abolish the Federal Department of Education. So he puts Terrell Bell up to run this commission, and the commission that came out with The Nation at Risk touched on none of those issues. Came out with the big, scare story report, that the mediocre performance of our school system threatens our future, would be viewed as an act of war if it were a foreign power. And so what you have today in politics, and we can talk about this a little bit more too, is you've got the Reagan education agenda still playing out with the children, as it were, of Reagan politics. You heard of Dan Forrest, is the daughter of former Representative Sue Myrick, who was a product of the surge of republicanism in the 1980s. And so the sons and daughters of those early Reaganites are now in power. And that's one piece of the change in Southern politics. And then the other is they are now questioning the dynamics that grew out of A Nation at Risk, which the Reagan administration proposed, and of No Child Left Behind, which the Bush administration proposed. So in many ways, what's going on in politics of the South with regard to education is Republicans arguing with Republicans. So now what do you want me to talk about?
Yeah. I guess this is a little along the same not just about Common Core, but what is it that we should understand about the South, and the sort of, are there shifts in political
Yeah.
power that are playing out and that we should think about when we're covering education in a more broad way?
Well, I think the essential thing to say here is that the South has become the base of the National Republican Party. The National Republican Party has no way to win the presidency without the South anymore. You know, it used to be called the Solid South for Democrats through much of the 20th century, and that's what the Southern strategy cracked. And now, you know, we used to talk about the Republicans having a lock on the South during the Reagan years. Well, this lock has grown even tighter, and so you know, there is no pathway to national prominence, you know, to the presidency for Republicans without sweeping all or most of the South. The South gives Republicans much of their strength in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so the Republican Party has been Southernized, as it were, and that's a mixed blessing. It certainly gives strength, particularly the Republicans' hold on Texas. But what it also means is that as the Republican primaries begin to play out in early 2016, only a year from now, I mean, even less, you know, this campaign will be intensifying, that Republican candidates for president will have to deal with the South. Many of the early primaries are in the South, particularly South Carolina, which has been a big test state in Republican primaries. North Carolina has a new law putting it within a week or so of South Carolina if certain criteria are met. And I saw the other day, I don't know this for certainty, but there's some talk about Republicans putting together a Super Tuesday in the South, the way Democrats used to talk about putting a Super Tuesday in the South on the first week of March 2016. And so just as Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012, you know, was shaped by his having to turn to the right to succeed in the South, so the South will have that pull on the Republican field to turn it more toward the right because of the way the primaries play out.
Well, I guess, you know, you talk about Republicans arguing with Republicans. We have a number of potential presidential candidates from the South who have staked themselves out differently on this issue.
Yeah.
You know, Jeb Bush for Common Core, and Bobby Jindal is kind of went back and forth on it, and Rick Perry and so forth. So, you know, is Common Core going to be a big part of this debate because they're kind of all over the map?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what's fascinating is that presidential politics usually is fought out on foreign affairs and economic strategies, taxes, and kind of that. And here's a case in which the concern about Common Core, that, as you heard in the previous panel, comes from both left and right, but is especially strong among Republicans. Suddenly, education may well be one of the core issues that determines how Republican voters will look at candidates in the Republican primaries. But it also shapes legislation at the state level too. I don't want to ignore that because of the way the Republican and Democratic parties have been reshaped in the South, and because of redistricting that solidifies heavily Republican districts as well as heavily Democratic districts, that Republican legislators are much more responsive to their own constituents and their own primary dynamics within their districts. So increasingly, legislators are in politically definable districts, so that the way this issue will play out, certainly in North Carolina, but also in other southern states, isn't that legislators are totally looking at statewide public opinion or regional or national public opinion. They're going to be looking at attitudes and the pressure points within their own districts. And the truth is that hardly any legislative districts now are so broadly based that they reflect broad state opinion or broad national opinion.
Well, let's open it up for questions.
So Common Core was partially the creation of the National Governors Association. What do you make of so many governors now turning against it? Is it just political opportunism?
That was 5 years ago. There have been elections since then. You know, and the issue has become intensified. Back 5 years ago, Lynn, you know, Common Core was birthed out of a long process that included both liberals and conservatives, that included the business community, the voice of business community. That's been an important player both in Republican politics, but also in the development of testing and standards, because business sees the need for elevating the quality of both the workforce and of the professional force in our country. And so, Common Core came out of a whole bunch of research about the differences between and among the states, different standards. It was hard to measure, and it was in part business that said we need some kind of way to look, way to compare and contrast, particularly between and among states, but also between the United States and nationally. And that's what's fascinating here, is that a lot of the constituencies, a lot of the think tanks work that went into Common Core represented a lot of conservative thinking or business-oriented free market thinking. But now, the way the country and our states have become polarized, you take Governor Jindal, for example, in Louisiana. I grew up in Louisiana, some of you know, and I followed politics there. He was featured in a film promoting Common Core that the Chamber of Commerce released on the same day that he held a press conference in Baton Rouge, I think it was in Baton Rouge, saying he was now opposed to the Common Core. And he's been on both sides of the issue because of the way the politics has shifted. And he's a pragmatic politician wanting to become the Republican candidate for president, and so he's kind of a test. That what seemed to be the right thing for him several years ago suddenly became suddenly became problematic as he was looking at running in Republican primaries.
Is it as simple as Common Core being identified with the Obama administration because of rates of death?
I think that's some of it. The developers of Common Core were very careful to say that they wanted this to be national standards but not federal standards. That was the distinction that was in the early discussions here. And the Obama administration, trying to be helpful, put in adoption of Common Core as one of the criteria, as one, that in the race to the top distribution of money, Common Core would be one of the factors. And that opened the door to it being perceived as federal standards, or at least it allowed the opponents of the Obama administration, who oppose anything the Obama administration wants to do, to raise an objection that, you know, to begin to define Common Core as not just national standards, but federal. Yes, ma'am.
So the first time that GS standards came to my radar was probably somewhere around 2002 or 2003 when Mike Cohen from the Chief came and talked to the Nevada State Board of Education. In a lot of states, these standards were put in place, didn't require legislative action. Do you feel like lawmakers feel like they somehow got snuck by them, or were they simply not paying attention, and now that there's this political pushback, they're trying to catch up?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to go beyond what I really know, state by state. I think what Lieutenant Governor Forrest signaled, you know, in his talk had something to do with it, that parents started raising questions. What is this new stuff here? Had something to do with it. But I also think, as you know, as Jane's question suggested, that suddenly the Obama administration was for it and they're against it. I think I also ought to say, this is not responsive to your question, I admit it, okay? But your question triggered this in my head. I began this little talk or interchange with Jane by reminding myself of A Nation at Risk. But I also should say that the South, in addition to now being, as Eric said earlier, ground zero about the pushback to Common Core, has had a long, you know, half-century history of education reform. You know, beginning in this state with Terry Sanford in 1960, who became the quintessential education governor, you know, pushing through a tax increase to elevate education, through Governor William Winter of Mississippi, you know, the groundbreaking education reform in his state of 1981. We've had this whole stream of education governors in the South, and they've worked real hard on it. And it's been bipartisan. That Lamar Alexander made his reputation before going into the Senate as an education reform governor in Tennessee, and Linwood Holton earlier, you know, took his two little kids by the hand, white kids, and put them in a desegregated school in downtown Richmond after he became governor. You know, and you know, you can think of a whole range of governors. Governor Hunt in North Carolina, and Governor Easley here. You know, and Governor Perdue, three straight Democratic governors. But even before them, Governor Holzhauser, the first Republican governor in North Carolina in the 20th century, is the guy who proposed statewide kindergartens. And so this assault on Common Core in the South is also partly an assault, maybe unintended or unspoken, assault on the emerging, what had emerged as the settled policy, as the consensus policy that Southern states needed to reform themselves in education step by step. That had been the policy stream of both Democrats and Republicans, and so and driven, as I said, largely by Democrats, but also by a lot of Republicans. That's how Jeb Bush and George Bush made their reputations in their successive states. And so I think we need to see the debate over Common Core also in that context too, that education reform didn't start with A Nation at Risk. It elevated it or pushed it to a level of intensity, but particularly in the South, there were a lot of Southern governors pushing for increased achievement, for higher pay for teachers, for new ways of teaching, even before a nation at risk.